Welcome to Pain Free and Strong Radio. My name is Dr. Tyna Moore. My guest today is Shawn Wells. I'm so excited to have him here. I've been a fan for a long time. I want to just list off some of your credentials here for the audience. You're the I love this world's greatest formulator. You are the CEO of Zone Halo, and I like what you're doing. I like the content you put out. I think that you really combine science with the things that I love, which is nutrition and strength and conditioning, and you've got a definition for biohacking here that I have to share with the audience because I admittedly interviewed one of my colleagues, Dr. Nasha Winters, about biohacking, and we talked about how naturopathy, I'm a naturopathic physician, we talked about how naturopathy was sort of the original biohacking. And I have to admit on the show, I did not dog biohacking, but I kind of critiqued it a little bit. You'll have to go back and listen. But your definition is so wonderful. You say biohacking aims to take power back. I'm all for take power back from big pharma, away from the government, away from authority, and away from organized religion. Give health, education, and knowledge about one's own body. Biohacktivism strikes to give the power back to the one who should own it, you, which I love. So welcome to my show, Shawn. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, I actually made up that term biohacktivism. I took like two terms, which were already mashups, biohacking, and then there's a term hacktivism that like Anonymous, who's a hacker group, or if you think of Julian Assange or Edward Snowden, like some of these guys have done positive things for society, wherever you fall on that issue. I don't know, but they've tried to do some things that they felt were positive, and that's known as hacktivism. And so I like this idea of like improving yourself so that you can improve the world around you, you know, kind of like putting the oxygen mask on yourself before, helping anyone else. You need to be like the best you can possibly be to help the world be a better place. So
absolutely.
That's my thought.
No, I love it. And it sort of screams of rebellion too, which is, I'm always for a good rebellion.
Yes, exactly.
I literally became a doctor because I was trying to rebel against the system that I had been so mismanaged by. So for my entire life. So I was like, I'm going to give people the truth. And that's the whole point of the show is I'm just trying to bring the truth to people and interview really good quality folks like yourself. I have such a cool network of people that I know, and I'm so excited that I get to connect with them here and just talk about things that I think matter, and sometimes things that are not as safe to, people don't often interview others on the more controversial topics. We're going to talk a bit about insulin and blood sugar and probably veer off into some other things. But what I think is important about that is, I don't know how to best explain this, and maybe you can based on the rambling that I sent to you this week in a message, but I find that with patients, often patients will have blood sugar dysregulation and elevated insulin. And when I share this with them, unless I really believe that prediabetes really is just phase 1 diabetes. I really think, people are in a metabolic dysfunctional state for usually quite a while before they get the nice number of diabetes, which is just a number that doctors like to assign and say, well, now you're here. But you've sort of always been there for about a decade. And all the bad things that are happening in the diabetic state are happening in the pre-diabetic state as well, and potentially to the same degree, honestly. And patients don't seem to get too concerned anymore. I've noticed over 10 years of practice that even back then they weren't that concerned, and now they're especially unconcerned. They're like, oh yeah, I've known that. I have fatty liver. My whole family has diabetes. I figured it was coming. And then on the flip side, I love strength and conditioning. I love lifting weights. Obviously insulin can be a tool in bodybuilding. I get that. In hypertrophy, it can be used, it's anabolic, so it can be used to help bodybuilders or people trying to put on muscle mass sort of take advantage of that. But I keep coming across people sort of dismissing insulin as being really an issue. And so I was hoping to get your opinion on all of this today. I want to break it down. I think you're a really smart guy and you might have some of the answers I'm looking for.
Okay. Well, insulin is anabolic for sure, but I think the other tissue that it can be anabolic to is adipose, promoting the storage of adipocytes or creating a storage of the adipocytes. So if you think about I mean, that's what it is really. Like you're storing energy in the case of glycogen or fat cells or whatever. So, but insulin out of control, certainly hyperinsulinemia is something that we want to keep in check. And then being on like a ketogenic diet or being on a low carb diet or Mediterranean diet, whatever it is going to potentially minimize that. But that's not the only thing. I think it's not just carbs per se, because I think like if you were to go back, I'm not as hardcore keto as people think I am, because if you look at, like, I do CKD and TKD, which are cyclical and targeted, but if you were to go back to our evolutionary times, like probably Rob Wolf would have talked about, you'd probably see that like during the summer, spring, whatever, we would have been eating carbs, but if you think about these carbs, they would have been resistant starches.
Mm-hmm.
They would have been very fibrous. Things like if you were to eat like a potato raw, if you were to eat things like oats raw, if you were to eat rice raw, all these things are resistant starches, and they basically would have no blood sugar impact. So it's very interesting to think about like some of these things. And then a lot of these other foods are very low glycemic that would occur in nature that we would have been eating. So we wouldn't have been eating like, the processed foods that are available now that are so quick to raise our blood sugar and our insulin. And then probably during the winter, we were dual fuel, and some people think this ketogenic diet is so weird, but it's not really weird. Like during the winter when there wasn't as much food available, we probably were hunting animals before there was storage of food. You can think about that as like, so, and then we might have gone several days without getting food.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that period of time, you would have had elevated ketones, right? And then when you're, eating just protein and fat from an animal, there would be elevated ketones. So, I mean, I think we were meant evolutionarily to be dual fuel. I think we were meant to have periods of intermittent fasting. I think we were meant to be active and moving, which we're not enough anymore. So you're not getting that upregulated GLUT4 to help with your insulin sensitivity. And there's so many things going on with just having a hypercaloric diet, too little exercise, high glycemic foods, probably not enough fiber, not enough resistant starches. All these things are kind of playing into that whole equation that you're talking about.
Absolutely. I just spent the weekend at a conference with Dominic D'Agostino and Dr. Paul Anderson, and it was great to hear them present the science behind all the things that I've been, believing for so long. And I think that what they really drove home was that cancer is a cellular crisis within the cell. And
Right.
that understanding, which makes sense to me and it makes sense to you, but really so is neuroinflammation, and so are all the things. And when I treat patients for chronic pain, for instance, I'm treating them basically on a neuroinflammatory wavelength. I mean, I am assuming by the time they get to me that they've been in chronic pain for a long time, and we are trying to address a brain that's on fire and it's driving the pain. So I know there's a biomechanical issue going on with the joint, but often there's this component of the brain inflammation. But that's the same process that drives cancer. And insulin is anabolic, and it's also anabolic to cancer cells. So,
Right. Exactly.
and I'm not trying to scare people away, but it's really important to understand when we so casually say get your blood sugar under control, that this has far-reaching consequences down the line throughout life. Also, they talked about cancer, and I'm not trying to bring up cancer to scare anyone. It's just an example that seems to get people's attention. This is really what's happening in a lot of conditions, but that elevated blood sugar is really ultimately, simplistically, what allows the cancer to break out of the cell and metastasize throughout the body. And so getting and keeping blood sugar in check is so critical, and ketosis is a really awesome way to do that. They also presented information showing that, a modified ketosis diet with exogenous ketones or using ketone supplements is also very helpful, and getting a lot of great results that way. And so I sort of live in a low carb. I used to fall into ketosis more readily. I think I did myself a disservice in school. I used it sort of as my secret weapon during finals week. And
Hmm.
because I went through two programs concurrently, and finals would overlap. And so I needed some kind of superpower, and that was ketosis. I stayed in it really long, and I didn't really mind my thyroid very well. And so I ended up crashing out my endocrine system pretty hard, but I'm sure chronic stress had something to do with that. But I do think ketosis is a really powerful tool. And it's something that people say, oh, well, ketosis is crazy. Or I hear a lot, you can't strength train or gain muscle if you're in ketosis. Some misnomers. Anyway, it's a great tool, keeping your insulin low. It's a great way to get yourself out of that hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia state. And that's what I think is so wonderful about it. Can you talk about strength training and ketosis a bit? Do you have any?
Well, yeah, I was just actually thinking just along the lines of what you were just talking about before I get to that is that a lot of disease states, if you track them back, even before you get to glycation and inflammation, which would be, like blood sugar damage as glycation, I can basically tell you if I was to pick two labs to judge your health, anyone's health, I would pick hemoglobin A1C and I would pick CRP.
Yep.
And I can tell you exactly like where you're heading.
Yep.
And I can probably tell you your lifespan and likelihood of getting any chronic disease. And if you track that further back, it's all related to mitochondrial dysfunction.
Yep.
So yeah, and cancer as a metabolic disease is definitely propagated from excess glucose feeding these cancer cells. There's a few of the cancers that some anti-keto people have pointed out that are maybe estrogen driven or some other things, but certainly it's at play, and it's at play in almost every disease state. And if you look at obviously the data, it's not like fat and saturated fat and some of these things that have been demonized for years are at play with any of them. It always goes back to this glycation, inflammation state, mitochondrial dysfunction. So this is just one thing I was thinking of. But as far as ketogenic dieting and exercise, were you talking about anaerobic, like just lifting, hypertrophy, that kind of thing?
I think more strength. I hear that you can't really gain or maintain strength if you're in ketosis. And
Yeah.
I am not as strong when I am in ketosis, but I think that's maybe I'm not doing it right, or I'm not programming my training around it right. So,
Yeah. Yeah, so there's a lot to that. Like I'm saying that you can be dual fuel using ketones or glucose, and there's certain advantages to both, and certainly it's advantageous to be able to tap into both. But we're so conditioned, adapted to being glucose as our one and only fuel that going into some weeks or months of adaptation, that's not going to undo like decades of adapting to using glucose primarily as our fuel. There are adaptations that do take place over time. Like we were just talking about mitochondria. Like one of the cool things about the ketogenic diet is that it will bypass the secondary complex of the mitochondria with the electron transport chain. And so that actually helps, I guess, go around this dysfunction potentially. So that's like the way that you get like the benefit with, Parkinson's, especially like a lot of the neurological diseases. And then, you can talk about Alzheimer's as type 3 diabetes,
yep.
and sometimes how it's referred to. So certainly, we're seeing benefit with the ketogenic diet or anything that will lower blood glucose be helpful in those disease states. But I personally do CKD and TKD only when I'm doing like competitive sand volleyball, which I play. But when I train with weights, which is 5 days a week, I I go in fasted and I go in, on my ketogenic diet. So I like making these adaptations, even if it's harder for you. I think it's still you're making these adaptations, basically at the point where the difficulty happens. Like it's like how they say like the first 10 reps doesn't matter. It's maybe the last rep, and that's kind of an oversimplification. But I think adaptation is going to take place like where the exertion, the stimuli is extreme. That's why like low intensity steady state is just burning calories. You're not really accomplishing that much. But when you're hitting these extremes, when you're going to failure, like that's when you're making these adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mind like whether, even if my workout isn't as long and I hit some wall, like that's where I want to be, is the wall.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I'm making adaptations. That's where I'm going to create more mitochondria. That's where I'm upregulating these MCT transporters for ketones, and all that kind of stuff is happening. So I think that's where the benefit is. And then going back to what you were talking about with thyroid, some people bring that up, that thyroid is potentially lowered on the ketogenic diet, but I think you actually have improved thyroid sensitivity that kind of compensates for that. Kind of like you wouldn't just go by insulin. You could also look at insulin sensitivity. If your insulin sensitivity is improved, maybe through more GLUT4, receptors, then you would lower your level of insulin.
Yes.
That's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think that can happen. I don't think your metabolic rate is negatively affected. If anything, they've shown that there might be some metabolic advantage on the ketogenic diet. As far as strength, my friends Dr. Wilson, Ryan Lowry, down in Tampa, they did a study where they looked at bodybuilders, very highly trained. They gave them a very difficult strength training routine. And one group had Western diet, one had the ketogenic diet. They did let them adapt over 2 weeks, which is a good period to have some adaptation. And they also did look at differences in glycogen and water weight too. So they actually looked at the muscle to see if there was any differences that could be accounted for there. And what happened was the Western diet and the ketogenic diet gained just as much strength across all those exercises, and they gained just as much muscle mass. The only thing that was unique to the ketogenic group is that they didn't gain the fat mass that the Western diet group added.
Awesome.
So
I'll have to look at that.
So it's really improved body composition over time, and so that's interesting. It was a very heavy training protocol. Again, trained athletes. So I think what you were talking about, it's difficult, like, to say what ketogenic dieting is. It's kind of like when people talk about, your gut microbiome. That's been discussed on ketogenic dieting. Well, it's like, okay, are you having artificial sweeteners? Are you eating kind of more of a vegan way? Are you having processed foods? Are you adding intermittent fasting in the mix with this? Are you, it's like there's so many different paths. Like ketogenic dieting just potentially means that you're just trying to elevate ketones, and there's a lot of ways that you could approach that. So, that's kind of a complex one to think about for sure.
Absolutely. You're right. I mean, it all depends on, I think that's where my whole argument with this insulin thing comes in, is because I hear some of these guys talking, and they're super smart guys, and they know their biochem, but they're taking in artificial sweeteners. They're also taking in, they're doing like refeeding days, which I get refeeding days. That makes some sense to me, where you spike your insulin purposely. But then they kind of, it's like, if you really start to look at artificial sweeteners, and you really start to, and what the macro quality is, what are you taking in? What is the quality of the food? That matters so much. If you're going to do a refeeding day, you don't refeed on garbage, you refeed on something healthful. Taking back to the thyroid, though, Dominic said something that I had just really this weekend was great because it was just a lot of reminders of things that I knew and I'd sort of veered away from because my whole practice became very orthopedic and I quit talking so much about these things with patients. But he said something smart about how really perhaps the thyroid hormone levels are going down, but the thyroid's just not having to rev so hard. The
Exactly. Yeah,
metabolism is just not revving. The engine
right.
doesn't have to rev so high. And that
Yep.
absolutely made sense to me. Paul
Yep.
Anderson said something really poignant. He said the thing about ketosis and keeping insulin in check, critical for cancer care, survival, quality of life, survival rates, remission of cancers, but that cancer, because it is so smart metabolically and so simple, it will find a way. And so ketosis will always keep it at bay, but that it has the ability to sort of adapt and move around these systems. And so he was talking about all the adjunctive therapies and how synergistic they are, like hyperbaric oxygen, et cetera.
Yep.
However, all done in conjunction synergistically, you get really great results. But in the groups that didn't want to do the ketosis as the diet, those are the ones that they maybe lived longer and had better quality of life, but they still ended up being the ones dying. So ketosis was absolutely critical. Keeping that insulin in check was absolutely critical. However, it wasn't the end all be all. And then you mentioned something great. I mean, you keep talking about adaptation, but really that's hormesis, and
Right. Yep.
which I
Exactly.
I love so much.
Yes.
And that's really why I strength train, and it's so hard to explain
Exactly.
to people that I'm really just trying to hermetically hit my system
Yep.
and then rest it. And I
Yep.
think that's part of intermittent fasting too, is that you
Yep.
are hermetically hitting yourself and then you're feeding yourself, which is the critical component. And so like I said, I think I was doing some of those things incorrectly in school because I was chronically stressed all the time, and like all bets are off when cortisol's all over the place.
Right.
But
Right.
that's
Yeah. So
part of this, right?
that's fascinating. Yeah. I love the whole hormetic thing. Yeah. Exactly. That's exactly what I was talking about. Because like if you're training at like 50% of your one rep max, you're not usually going to get some kind of your body doesn't need to respond and say, oh my, we need to change some things here. We need to, create more muscle mass. We need to create more neural pathways. We need to, it's not happening because you're not really pushing your body to some extreme point. So for sure, that's definitely correct. And one thing I've been thinking more about it, 'cause I've been experimenting more lately, is that I think a lot of people that talk about being in ketosis, like you're saying, and actually Dr. Jacob Wilson and Ryan Lowry did another study where they did CKD and where they were allowed to eat carbs on the weekend, and they did, so that's cyclical ketogenic
Mm-hmm.
dieting. And then they'd eat ketogenically through the week. And what they found is that, and this was with strength training athletes, that, and even with that, them being young, athletic, strength training, that it was Thursday that when they got back into ketosis, and then come Friday night or whatever, like they're back on carbs. So you have a very small window potentially. But one thing I've been experimenting with is intermittent fasting and fasting, and I've noticed that you can be on a ketogenic diet and stay in this like zero point 0.5 to 1 to 1.5 millimole range like for months, like
Mm-hmm.
just where especially if you're doing net carbs and you have some things, and like so you're in a nutritional ketosis, but to really get to like that magical, ketogenic thing, like where you're in that, three, let's say like deeper into ketosis, where you get that cognitive clarity, that enhancement that I think a lot of people that have done ketogenic diets may or may not experience unless they've fasted. And so I've actually been playing around with just if I eat low carb, not necessarily ketogenically, and fast, it seems to be more powerful than just a nutritional ketogenic diet
Mm-hmm.
for getting my ketones up,
Mm-hmm.
which is interesting to me. I think like so basically I'm saying that fasting is more powerful than eating ketogenically. Certainly the two together would be the best of both worlds. But fasting is a very powerful tool, and there's intermittent fasting, the calorie controlled you can do, or the time feeding restriction. You can do like 16 and 8, where you're not eating for 16 hours, you're eating for an 8-hour window. Some people do 20 and 4, and then some people do like the every other day, which there's some interesting data coming out on that as well. So
I think that when you get into a level of ketosis at all, or just that low carb with those extended fasting periods, you can feel amazing on that. It gets you high, and you feel awesome.
yes,
And when you're used to
yeah.
feeling crappy all the time, that's a pretty good place to be. So,
I mean, I can tell you that like a few hundred years ago, you can argue about what we ate, 10,000 years ago, but I'm saying it probably was dual fuel, like especially before, fire and before food storage and all that. But if I can tell you, like 100 years ago, artificial sweeteners, artificial flavors, GMOs, antibiotics, RBGH, RBST, all this stuff like wasn't in the food supply. All these just highly processed foods, right? So I think it's not orthorexic to like eat whole food.
right.
And then, in eating whole food, I think that's the best step right there. If you can just get somebody, one, I think to reduce their sugar intake dramatically, and then get on whole food, that's a great step. Like I don't even think you need to. If you feel like ketogenic dieting is too crazy or difficult, then that's fine. Like I think that's a massive step towards your health, is just eating whole food and getting rid of the majority of the sugar in your diet, having an exercise routine, maybe playing with some fasting here and there, like that would be great.
I would love if you tell the audience what the GLUT4 receptor is and what that means, and when people are doing strength training, how that affects the GLUT4 receptor and how that affects insulin.
Yeah, it's there's translocation of glucose into the cell for use of energy, and so there's more receptors that are active around the cell that are taking up that glucose. So that would be an issue if you had very little receptor activity on your cells to use that glucose, and that's where you're going to have like excess glucose, in the serum, and that's going to put you in a state of hyperinsulinemia, right? Like because you have high blood sugar, and the insulin stays elevated for a long time, and you're not quickly taking it into the cell, and that happens. That upregulation happens like with exercise, in particular. So like that's why like the whole like post-workout like high glycemic carb thing, that's where that came from in particular. But going back to like with muscle mass and strength training on a ketogenic diet, most people wonder like if the protein like being so much lower on a ketogenic diet, because you don't want to be in a gluconeogenic area where you're basically converting your protein over to glucose when you have too high a protein. That's a concern, like on a ketogenic diet versus just low carb, where I think people eat tons of protein. They're just eating meat like crazy. And people are concerned about keeping their protein at like maybe 20% of calories. But what we've learned about the ketogenic diet is that it's lean body mass sparing because, and that makes sense, like if you were in starvation, you would protect lean body mass, right? So you would utilize fat mass first for energy, for fuel, after you've used up glucose, glycogen. And then it makes sense to spare that. So leucine, in particular, is spared with the ketogenic diet. So the threshold to turn on muscle protein synthesis is most likely lower in the ketogenic dieting state. So instead of, and it's hard to like say like what a number is of like grams that you would take in. It's really about how quickly you hit the threshold in the plasma. So you can say, oh, it's 2.5 grams or 3.5 grams is what you need to take. it's not really the exact answer because it's just how quickly your body is taking it in and you can use it. And I think insulin sensitivity actually plays a role in that, in how quickly you can hit your plasma levels of this the amino acid. And so that's why I think like as you age, it's been shown that your need for protein is higher, and then there's that effect of like sarcopenic obesity where you're trading off like muscle mass for fat mass, and I think that's because as you age, you're rarely hitting that muscle protein synthesis at an optimal state because you're just not getting enough protein slash leucine.
Right.
Like it might take 3.5, 4.5, 5.5 grams, to hit that, and that would be, if you were to look at like whey, like 25 grams of whey protein is like 2.8 grams of leucine. You might have to have like 40 grams of whey or 50 grams of whey. How many elderly adults are getting that much?
Right.
So, and they've been told to eat 6 to 8 small meals a day and kind of graze throughout the day, and then you're never really optimizing muscle protein synthesis. You're getting a decent amount of protein as a substrate, but you're not hitting that plasma threshold that I'm talking about. So the fact that the ketogenic diet is leucine sparing, it's anti-catabolic, and there's even some data showing that BHB might have some anabolic properties. That's how I think that once you're adapted to at least the ketogenic diet, that you're not going to lose the lean body mass that some people fear off being a lower level of protein.
I see. So it's important to hit that leucine threshold in a meal, in a feeding. It's not something where you can just eat little quantities of protein throughout the day and hope for the best, correct?
Correct.
Yeah, I know. I think that's a problem. I think that's something I do too. It's hard to sort of consume all that but no, it makes absolute sense. Can you talk about, try to explain this a lot to people, the sarcopenic obesity concept. I think that we're seeing this honestly in young people. I know that it's obviously considered a thing of the elderly, but I think we're seeing it I'm sure I had it when I was in my 30s. I was getting out of school. I was 115 pounds. I was skin and bones, and my metabolic panel did not look good. I see a lot of women, obviously. I was guilty of it too. I grew up in Southern California, and our culture of just trying to get as small as possible and not understanding body composition. Just because you can fit in a size 2 or size 4 pair of jeans does not mean you're anywhere near healthy, because a large quantity of that thigh might be fat and not muscle. And that's sarcopenic obesity, and it perpetuates itself, because then their hormones dump out, and then the whole thing it's a shit show pretty much at that point. And as they age, they end up in my office in their 50s and 60s in chronic pain, body-wide chronic pain, and they don't know what's going on. And I'm like, oh man, this started in your 20s. This is being that, and then especially if you're we joke in school, it's not that funny, but osteoporosis is a skinny white girl disease.
Yep.
If you're thin and Caucasian and you're female, you're pretty much looking at dead in the eye. That was another reason I started strength training. I just thought, I do not want to be held up, and I certainly don't want to break a hip. So would you talk about sarcopenic obesity a little bit and what that means and how insulin actually can be high in those situations?
Yeah. So what you're talking about, yeah, exactly. That I was going to say that too. That bone mineral density can play a role in I guess favorable weight being lost. Being in a dehydrated state, like many people are, can play a role in that. And then losing your lean body mass, your muscle tissue in particular, that's playing a role in that. So going along with what I just said before about maybe not hitting that optimal muscle protein synthesis state too often, and then fat mass is being traded for that. So sometimes you can see someone, like you're saying, hit their ideal BMI, or they're at the right weight, they're at a quote unquote healthy weight, but they've traded off that lean body mass, the muscle tissue, and the bone mineral density for the fat mass. And then you see someone like this fall. I worked in nursing homes as well as hospitals, and you'd see someone fall, like could be 55, 60, 65. They fracture a hip because they don't have that muscle mass to balance them, to give them strength, to cushion them to some degree. And we know that having more muscle mass and strength training, that's going to keep the bone mineral density there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when they fall and they have poor bone mineral density and they have just, mostly fat mass and very little muscle mass, they fracture that hip and, they're in the hospital, they get, a urinary tract infection, or they get a pressure ulcer or some of these kinds of things. And then, I've seen people die like just from going through like this really horrible cycle.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be depression related and some other things too, not eating while they're in these environments. But it can be a very sad cycle of, and they seem like they're quote unquote healthy as far as body weight. So it's definitely a real thing to be concerned about with sarcopenic obesity.
It is, and it really, in my opinion, is the kiss of death. And it starts so young. It starts with our culture overemphasizing just thinness versus body composition, especially in women. And so women really, I was that girl, strive to be as thin as humanly possible without ever thinking about the long-term consequences of that. And then looking at BMI and saying, oh, they're great. Either they're underweight or they're at the right weight, but not ever considering muscle mass and the ratio to fat mass. And that fat starts infiltrating the muscle and marbles it. And then it really, I wrote a whole paper about it in the NDNR called Muscle is Medicine. It's a little sciencey for the average audience, but it's really just, it breaks down how this process goes and how it leads into these chronic degenerative conditions that our whole country is suffering from. So everything from heart disease to chronic inflammation, it drives that whole cycle. And muscle mass is one of the few organ systems that we have control over. I can build it.
Mm-hmm.
I can build this muscle on my frame, and I can change my whole chemical milieu just by doing that. Muscle secretes myokines, which are anti-inflammatory. Interleukin-6 coming from a muscle is anti-inflammatory, but coming from the fat cells, it's pro-inflammatory. So you have a lot of marbled muscle, you're going to have more inflammation. Anyway, I'm digressing, but that whole system gets screwed up when your insulin's high. You actually,
yes.
it slants you towards sarcopenic obesity. People
Sure.
who have elevated insulin and blood sugar dysregulation end up with skinny arms and skinny legs. They can't build the muscle necessary.
Yeah, and going back to the ketogenic diet, I do think like in the case of with someone that has like metabolic syndrome, who's maybe older, who doesn't like to exercise much, they've been, like you were saying, going through decades of this kind of down this path. That is a diet that is just highly effective. And
Mm-hmm.
yes, and I've seen it compared to like low fat and exercise. And the low carb was actually showed better results than and that was low carb with no exercise. It showed better results than low fat with exercise.
Wow.
Or for weight loss. So, yeah, it's like, so to me, like, and a lot of the people that I hear talking about it in this way, they get frustrated about it are, people that are in the fitness community, as well as, they're educated and they're nutrition PhDs or whatever, but they're very fit. They've always been fit. They haven't battled back decades of metabolic syndrome in the same way that like some of these people are. And I do think that if I was to pick one diet where someone is not that active and is in an insulin resistant state, there's just so many studies that show that would be the best one to choose.
Absolutely.
You can make an argument if that person's like already lean, like if someone comes to me and they're like, just naturally lean, muscular, and they're eating high carbs, I'm like, okay, that's great. Like go, that's your thing. That's great. But, for someone that, high carbs and, has a lack of exercise and they've always overate and this has been going on a long time and they have all the dysfunction from metabolic syndrome, it's clear to me that that's what I'd recommend. And I don't think there's there's much arguing that, but there is a lot of arguing for some reason over that.
Thank you for saying
Just
that, because
frustrating.
it is. It's really frustrating, and there's there's degrees of knowledge, and I love that we're all on this journey, all of us who are interested in this kind of more functional slant on things. But there's pieces to the puzzle sometimes that go so deep, and it's also clinical experience, just having I've been in practice for 10 years and I worked with a doc for 10 years prior to that. I'm not saying I have all the experience in the world, but just having the clinical experience and seeing it, a lot of this stuff is easier said than done, but you're absolutely right. You get somebody into ketosis, their chronic infections clear up because you starve them off. You starve the bugs, the pathologic bugs in the gut, and you often create a much healthier microbiome. It's the carbohydrate that is, and it's these acellular carbohydrates. Just going back to the beginning of this conversation, talking about fibrous, what everyone's eating right now is just acellular carbohydrates, which it's kind of a nightmare to the body. The body doesn't really know what to do with that. It's kind of
Right.
it kind of just starts off the whole storm of mess, and the bad bugs grow and they crowd out the good bugs. And we've been talking for the entire length of the naturopathic profession since we've been around, that the gut, start with the gut, treat the gut first. So it's really exciting that this microbiome research is catching up to what we've always sort of preached to patients. But that low carbohydrate, as you said, even Dr. D'Agostino was talking about low carbohydrate with, and I'm sure there was, percentages of what that carbohydrate intake was, but along with MCT oil and exogenous ketones having almost identical effects to a strict keto, low keto,
Yeah.
strict classical ketosis diet. So, there's various ways to do this, and you're right. Especially when people are in chronic pain or they're dealing with chronic obesity, chronic blood sugar dysregulation. Paul talked about that. Paul Anderson. He's like, it's great if you guys want to. This is alluding to what you said. It's great if you can get into ketosis. It's great if you can get your patients, but how they ate for their entire life absolutely has something to do with how things are going to turn out for them to some degree. So it's important, like you said, it's not just about being in it for a week or two and then judging it on that, or even a month or two. It depends on, if they were sugar burners their whole life, that's going to be a different story than somebody who maybe has always run lean and eaten low carb.
Right. Well, probiotics are creating butyrate in the gut, and that's actually where like a lot of your gut health, your gut microbiome friendly environment would come from, the short chain fatty acid. And so when you eat butter, heavy cream, things like that that have butyrate, that's great to feed the gut. MCTs are the next level up, like let's say 6, 8, 10 carbons. Those get broken down fairly readily into butyrate. And then BHB, that may be, there's a heavy correlation there with like ketones, like being, and even the exogenous ketones that you're talking about usually are BHB, beta hydroxybutyrate, are butyrate based. So there's like some heavy interplay, I think, that hasn't been demonstrated quite yet between this short chain fatty acid in the gut and the ketones from the ketogenic diet or from fasting. But certainly, I think when you're having MCTs, you're having like the heavy cream or the butter, actually even acetic acid, like from vinegar, which is the shortest chain fatty acid, which would be C2. Maybe enough of that might actually promote more butyrate as well.
Mm.
So it's all interesting. I think there's a lot to be dug into, but yeah, that's what I was saying before with what you're referring to, is that I think that a low carb and intermittent fasting can potentially trump just a ketogenic diet. So yeah, certainly, yeah, playing around with MCTs. I really like the caprylic acid over just straight MCTs, which is a mix of the medium chain triglycerides. The C8 in particular is maybe about 3 times better at raising ketones than the blend that you usually get in MCTs.
Awesome. That's a good tip. Does it give you as much of the gastric distress as the MCTs do, or is it less?
not quite as bad. It can be there. You definitely need to titrate up, but
Hmm.
the fact that it's quite a bit more potent at raising ketones, I think you can get away with using less.
Okay.
So in that way, it might be better for people that struggle with the GI distress.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's good to know. And really, again, just this brings it all back to just eating real food and not eating all day long. That's
Correct.
really what it comes down to for people is, like you said, we would not have had plentiful food at all times. We have turned into a feeding trough, pretty much. Food is always there. It's always acellular carbs, meaning it doesn't have a good, healthy fibrous cell wall. There's just a lot of garbage available at all times for people. And I think that's more than
Yeah.
anything.
When you like people like someone had said on Facebook the other day that sugar wasn't addictive because you wouldn't just eat spoonfuls of it. But if you think about addiction and if you read about like the bliss point with food engineers that literally like are built their whole career around addiction and like why is it that you might like something like bacon or you might like certain foods that are salty, sweet, have a certain fatty, crunchy texture, like potato chips, like you never get enough, right? There's a reason that we love these things,
Hmm.
and it's because of that. It's hitting this bliss point for us. It's literally like releasing neurotransmitters, and we're like almost orgasmic from eating food. And so people are addicted to that. And if you walk in a convenience store and you look around, you're going to see all these like shiny, colorful things, and it's all built on addiction. Like it's
Hmm.
a convenience store, right? Like it's literally trying to like trap your mind into like impulsivity. And you have cigarettes, lottery tickets, alcohol, and you have sugary carbs, right? I mean, that's what the whole store is.
Hmm.
And so, and
God, you're so right.
it's different color, Gatorades and sodas, and then there's candies and the bright packages up by the register. And, I mean, it's hard. It's actually hard to go in one of those stores and walk away, right?
Yeah.
Like with nothing, just paying for your gas. And that's what they want. I mean, they're literally fostering every addiction possible
Yep.
in there. And I think sugar is powerful. I mean, how many times have you had like a dessert or a treat or candy or something and you snuck it or didn't tell someone or like you don't want to be seen. It's like that's an addiction. Like it's how many people would say they know drinking sugar sodas or having candy is bad for you. I bet like 95% of people if you polled them.
Right.
And then how many people would say that they still have it anyway?
Hmm.
Okay, well then it's addictive. Like if you know it's not good for you, but you're doing it, then why would you do that? Because there's something overriding your cognitive train of thought, like to say no to something, right? Because otherwise you would say no.
Well, sugar
Um,
lights up so many parts of your brain, whereas most drugs just hit one, neural pathway or one neurotransmitter pathway. Sugar just sort of lights the whole thing up like a pinball machine. So
right.
it's a very, very addictive legal drug. I always say insulin or sugar is Satan and insulin is its minion.
80% of us, we're all like on this spectrum, like you're saying, like heading towards metabolic syndrome. And I can tell you
Yep.
that when I was working in a nursing home, that almost every single person that was in there, like that was 80 and up, had it. It's like we're all heading down that road. You'll almost most certainly get it eventually if you're on the Western diet,
Yep.
you're not exercising, you're eating in a hypercaloric state. It's you're on your way.
I absolutely agree. It's a matter of time. I mean, I joke with my boyfriend because I'll say something about someone and he's like, "Oh, you think everybody," and I'm like, "Oh no, that they will. It's just a matter of time. Time will tell." And just show me your labs, really. And that's so funny. You said hemoglobin A1C and C-reactive protein. I'm like, just show me your labs, and then we can stop this argument right now because you're already headed there. Like I can tell by looking at them. But anyway, that's a
And the sad thing is we don't look at those labs.
I
We
do.
don't like. I know, it'd be nice, but like, I mean, I can tell you from going through thousands of charts with patients that like, it is a rare thing. Obviously, once they have type 2 diabetes, you might look at hemoglobin A1C, but like we should be looking at these labs,
Yeah,
throughout the life cycle, and there's so many diseases that could be prevented, like, because it's such a clear sign of, like, inflammation, glycation, like that's the impetus for all these chronic diseases. You
absolutely.
know, every one of them, like, cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, you name it. Like, it's cancer, just everything would track back to that. I wish, like, we were looking at that in just the general population, like just annually, like what are your
Yep.
numbers?
Yeah.
But
Would be a lot more
you know,
potent than just running cholesterol. And
oh yeah.
no, I'm with you. I'm absolutely with you.
Cholesterol, again, can I talk quickly on that? So, like,
Sure.
when people get worried about being on the ketogenic diet and cholesterol, my doctor says such and such cholesterol. First off, it's a calculated number. It's not very accurate. Um, when they look at HDL and LDL, LDL is not bad. It's not the bad cholesterol. The VLDL, like your small dense LDL, is the one that is correlated to. That's the subfraction that is correlated to cardiovascular disease risk. But LDL itself is not, and especially the large fluffy LDL. So
Hmm.
what happens with the ketogenic diet is sometimes you do get an increase in LDL, but you get an increase in the subfraction, this large fluffy LDL, which is actually pro health. It improves your mortality. So I think that creates some confusion. If somebody wants to get an accurate look at their cholesterol subfractions, talk to your doctor and say, I want to look at an NMR test or a VAP test, and you can see, like, those subfractions more clearly in an accurate way, and then you can have an educated discussion on it. But to use a total cholesterol, they've shown this is the weirdest thing. It just blows my mind. Total cholesterol, HDL, LDL, any of them are elevated. They're all actually correlated to improved mortality outcomes.
Hmm.
And when they're low, they're correlated to worse, greater risk of death. So
Yeah.
I just don't understand. Like, it's just baffling. Like, I really feel like the whole cholesterol thing is just baffling. It's created just a monster um, moneymaker. It's just it really it blows me away. And the risk of being on statins, it puts you at greater risk for cardiovascular outcomes. And
And diabetes, like
yeah,
untouched,
yeah.
and it's tough diabetes to treat too. When I was in general practice, that was the kind of diabetes I could not get people out of. I mean, I couldn't bring them back nearly as readily as I could with somebody else, putting them on a low carbohydrate diet and doing all the different things. Um,
Well,
it was almost like it just certainly broke the metabolism.
right. And well, cholesterol is like the basis for, like, the phospholipid, like in our brains, the cell itself, and also it's kind of like the master steroid hormone, if you will, for, like,
Hmm.
estrogen, like beta estradiol, estrone, progesterone, testosterone. All this stuff is, like, has
Cortisol.
cholesterol. Yeah, exactly. So it's just crazy to take statins and put yourself at greater risk. And then there's, like, all the cramping and the CoQ10 depletion that
Hmm.
happens with it, and there's just so many side effects, and it's absurd to me.
It's one of my great
So
joys in life to get people off statins.
yeah,
it's
yeah,
it is it's like it's a mission goal for me. I'm like, because they come in with chronic musculoskeletal pain, bilateral hip pain, that all started after the statin started, and I'm like, hey, guess what? I can prescribe this. I can take you off it, and lo and behold. Plus, having low cholesterol. I mean, talk about. Oh, sorry, the mail just came. Having low cholesterol is the kiss of death. It's your
exactly,
chances
yeah,
of
that
dying from cancer, accidents because your brain simply can't process things. You have no hormones. It's a nightmare. I suffer from low cholesterol, and it's really hard to get my hormonal status up. So
If you look at all the epidemiologic studies, like the populational level studies, like it's just that's why I don't know how this came to be. Like it's like every single study says this, that like the higher the cholesterol, the better the outcome for mortality, and the lower the cholesterol, the worse the outcome. It's bizarre.
There's a book you should read. It's called Prescribing by Numbers, and I'll send you the
Uh-huh.
link. It explains it all. It was very calculated. this was
Yeah.
this,
That.
this was pharmaceutical industry driven. So, um, well, we've got to wrap the show up, Shawn.
Yeah.
It's been so fun. I think I could talk to you all day about this stuff.
Yeah.
We'll have to do a part two and dive into some more of it. Can you tell the
Yeah.
audience where to find you? Because I can't even quite figure out what all you're doing. You're sort of everywhere. So,
Thank you. Yes, so you can go to my website, zonehalo.com, ZONEHALO, zonehalo.com. And then you can find me on social media the same way, with at zonehalo. And I have a lot of good content. Like you said, I go over, inspirational, meditational stuff, as well as all the biohacking things, really. So just, gratitude and meditation, that kind of stuff, but also like the right nutritional interventions,
mhm.
supplementation, and even, yeah, I'm not like anti-pharmaceutical. I discuss quite a few pharmaceuticals in there that may have benefit. So any mode of improving quality of life and quantity of life, I'm in for exploring. So yeah,
I love it. He's definitely one to follow on Instagram and on Facebook, and I'll put those links in the podcast so the audience can find them. Well, it's been such an honor to have you, and I'm finally glad we get to
thank
talk
you.
face to face. And
Yeah,
I've really enjoyed your work over following, I think, the last year or two. So keep it up. It's awesome. I love your definition of biohacking. I think I'll be kinder and gentler on that word from now on, since I since it
okay.
since it definitely reflects some rebellion. So you've been listening to Pain Free and Strong Radio. I'm Dr. Tina Moore. My guest today was Shawn Wells. I hope you guys caught the whole episode. We've got a lot of good information in here. And you can find me on my site at www.drtina.com. That's drtyna.com. And we will be back next week. Thank you.